Thank you, Tony, for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to Natalia also, and whoever else was involved in organizing, and to Thomas for helping all in so many ways. And is it Jody who also helped, or who's been helping me anyway? So I'm going to talk about emotion, schizophrenia, and surprise. I should apologize to maybe a couple of people in the audience who may have heard some of this or maybe somewhat familiar with this, some of my material, which is because my talk is based on some previous work, some of which is published on emotion and schizophrenia. But I'm going to try to talk now more about these topics in the light of the issue of surprise, bringing that in a number of times. But I want to admit sort of at the outset that I don't really have that clear a position yet on how to define surprise and so on, and I very much appreciate all the talks that I've heard over the last couple of days for many reasons, but also including helping me think about how to conceptualize surprise. But let me begin talking more about emotion or affect, especially in schizophrenia, but not only in schizophrenia, and a little while later I'll get to the issue of surprise. Now, emotion in schizophrenia, can you all hear me okay? No problem in the back? Okay. Emotion in schizophrenia is often described in what can seem quite contradictory terms. There's a classic symptom or sign of such persons, schizophrenic persons, called in psychiatry flat affect, which refers to a diminishment of emotional expression that has frequently been, for example, of bodily or facial gesture and that sort of thing, that's frequently been assumed to indicate diminished emotional response on the subjective plane. In autobiographical accounts of schizophrenia, persons who have suffered from the illness often describe a deadening of emotional vitality. But other accounts portray such persons as having abnormally intense emotional responses and often as being hypersensitive to affective or emotional stimuli. Now, this appearance of contradiction in the literature, on the clinical literature describing schizophrenia, can be resolved in various ways. For example, one might want to distinguish between subtypes of patients, or between stages of the illness, or perhaps between expression and experience of emotion, which may not go together. But today, in my paper, I want to pursue a stranger and more intriguing possibility, which is that the affective lives of persons with schizophrenia, sometimes at least, do have a certain, in a sense, contradictory quality. That is, that such patients can, at the very same moment, and on the subjective plane, in the realm of experience, they can experience both, in a certain sense, diminishment and exaggeration of emotional or affective response. Now, early in the 20th century, the German psychiatrist Ernst Kretschmer offered an account of what he called schizothymia. Is this visible, by the way, to people? Okay, good. Which is schizothymia, the temperament that he believed to be characteristic of schizoid and schizophrenic individuals. And he described this as involving the presence of two opposite aspects or tendencies, schizophrenia. On the one hand, there's hypersensitivity, tenderness, nervousness, vulnerability. On the other hand, insensitivity, coldness, numbness, indifference. Nor is this, in Kretschmer's view, merely a matter of expression versus experience, say coldness overtly, but an inner sensitivity. It's not just that. Both aspects, according to him, are always present in some way, even on the plane of subjective or felt reaction. So he alone, this is a quote from Kretschmer, has the key to the schizoid or schizothymic and thus schizophrenic temperament, who has clearly recognized that the majority of schizoids, people with this temperament, including schizophrenics, which is what he meant by this terminology, are not either oversensitive or cold, but that they are oversensitive and cold at the same time, and that in quite different relative proportions. He quotes August Strindberg, the playwright, who was a very schizothymic and sometimes psychotic individual who experienced psychotic episodes and who said of himself, this is Strindberg, "I am hard as ice and yet so full of feeling that I am almost sentimental." Now, despite the odd, even contradictory nature of Kretschmer's account, I do think he puts his finger on a key aspect of schizophrenia, and one that may be especially central for accounting for what's called in psychiatry the Praecox-Gefühl, or the precox feeling. This is a reference to the old term for schizophrenia, dementia precox, so it means the schizophrenia feeling, if you will, which is the feeling of strangeness or remoteness, of encountering something beyond normal emotional contact or rapport, a feeling that normal persons will often have in the presence of a person with schizophrenia. But how is it possible to account for what I want to call the Kretschmerian paradox? Isn't it simply nonsensical, in a way logically contradictory, to say that a person is at the same moment both hypo and hypersensitive, both emotionally flattened and yet somehow affectively hyper-alive? I want to offer a phenomenologically oriented account that might help to make some sense of this paradox or seeming contradiction, and perhaps to illuminate, at least to some extent, this mysterious, perhaps ineffable domain of schizophrenic experience. I want to discuss three distinct aspects of schizophrenia pertaining to the lived body, number one, number two, perceptual experience, and number three, the life of the imagination. And I want to discuss how each of these is consistent with the Kretschmerian paradox. These are issues I've discussed elsewhere, but as I noted, I want to put emphasis today on the issue of surprise and, to some extent, the related theme of suspense, which can be seen as bound up with the very essence of emotionality and emotional response. But before proceeding, I have to say a few words about the general concept of emotion and related terminology. In his comprehensive survey of psychological research and theorizing about emotion, Nico Vrijda, I don't know how you pronounce this. Someone know how to pronounce that? Anyways, a Dutch psychologist, prominent psychologist, Nico Vrijda, lists three crucial components of emotion. And this is actually a fairly standard view. This is his formulation of something that lots of psychologists would say more or less in this way. First of all, a bodily or physiological component, usually involving arousal. Second, a particular way of viewing one's situation or worldly context, call it a cognitive component. And thirdly, a particular action tendency or state of action readiness, which is a sort of motoric component. In addition to these three components, Vrijda lists several features of the experienced situation that must be present for something truly to count as an emotion, and that when present in high degree will serve to intensify the emotion in question. To elicit emotion, a given object or situation cannot be experienced as a mere figment of imagination. It must have a quality of objective reality. It also must be experienced as having relevance for oneself, and this relevance must have the qualities of urgency and seriousness. Underlying all of this is a more general quality that he calls concern, meaning experiences having emotional significance always touch upon issues that matter to us and that matter in an ongoing way, such as our desire for survival, for intimate human contact, or for respect from other people. Emotions, as the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, just summarizing what I just said, so those are features of the situation that must be present, and the more they're present, the more things will be emotional, according to Vrijda. Emotions, as the philosopher Martha Nussbaum puts it, are not, quote, unthinking energies that simply push the person around without being hooked up to the ways in which the person perceives or thinks about the world. They are rather, she says, forms of evaluative judgment that ascribe to certain things and persons outside a person's own control great importance for the person's own flourishing, end quote. Now, to this, perhaps one should add that to describe the things, persons, and events as outside one's control is of course, it would seem to me also to ascribe to them the possibility of surprise. Now, a similar set of points is made in Heidegger's Being in Time, where the concept of Sorge, often translated as care, and the role of temporality have a central place, of course, as we know. According to Heidegger, the analysis of care reveals the indispensable role of our experience of and in the medium of time. Care is, quote, from Heidegger, only possible through temporality, end quote, for care is precisely a form of future directedness, of, in his jargon, being ahead of oneself in the sense of being concerned about and uncertain about just where and how one will be in the next moment or period of time. It is a form of anticipation, one involving some degree of uncertainty that is lived in the present and in which Dasein confronts its own possibilities for being, in which, quoting from Heidegger now, Dasein in its own most potentiality for being comes toward itself, end quote. Care, Sorge, however, is grounded in the character, is also grounded in the character of having been, and in what William James would have called a specious present, that is, a sense of the present that's infused with a sense of emerging out of a past and projecting toward a future, which perhaps amounts, one could say, to a phenomenological characterization of the, I think it was Bruno referred to the notion of the anticipation machine. The brain is, was that the phrase? Anticipation machine? Now being described phenomenologically, so to speak. Now, it seems obvious enough that surprise, or at least the possibility thereof, plays a crucial role in many emotions, at least in what we might call the forward-looking emotions. Since, in a sense, maybe in all of them, that would be an interesting thing to talk about, since, in a sense, the possibility of surprise, that is, of some degree of unpredictability, is an index, one might say, of the reality of the events that affect us. And as suggested, what I've been saying before, only events experienced as real in some sense are fully capable of arousing our most intense emotional responses. By the way, I'm probably using surprise in a rather broad and inclusive sense, which some other people, I mean, Jeffrey, for example, is one person who was inclined to use it that way, perhaps a broader sense than some of the speakers have. Also, to the extent that emotion is related to forms of bodily response, surprise will also play a crucial role, given that many important forms of physiological reactivity require a sense of unexpectedness. This, by the way, is apparent, for example, in the impossibility of tickling oneself, because when you can't tickle yourself because it has to do with the fact that you know what's going to happen, so to speak. And so your capacity for bodily reactivity is lessened. Surprise also requires certain, we could call them conditions of possibility. One of these, seems to me, is that it must, by definition, occur against a background of relative predictability. In the absence of such predictability, it's not clear that we could speak of surprise in the true sense of that term, since we would be speaking of something more like a general background sense of, I don't know how to put it, agitation, anxiety, or something. So surprise, you could say, is in this sense a bit reminiscent of Wittgenstein's analysis, famous analysis of the nature of doubt and uncertainty. These are things that will occur, perhaps must occur, against a background of relative predictability. It's also reminiscent of what several people have said about what must precede surprise for surprise even to be possible. But in schizophrenia, at least at times, I'm not saying this is always the case in schizophrenia, but sometimes, there could be an absence of the most basic sense of the ongoing continuity of the world, of what Ludwig Binswanger referred to as the breakdown in the consistency of ongoing natural experience. Very vague phrase, but I think this is what he means, a breakdown in the consistency of ongoing natural experience. This is well featured in the following description, which I don't have on a slide. I'm going to read to you from a German language, I think he was Swiss writer Robert Walser, who was an important writer in early 20th century, who was also schizophrenic and spent many years in asylums. So here's a quotation from him, which is meant to illustrate this lack of a sense of predictability. "A shiver passed through me. I hardly dared to walk on. One impression after another seized hold of me. I was swaying, everything was swaying. All the people here had plans in mind, business. A moment before, I too had had an end in view, but now no plans at all. I sought some fixed point, but found none. In the midst of the unrelenting forward thrust, I found the wish to stand still. The muchness and the motion were too much and too fast. Everyone withdrew from everyone. There was a running as of something liquefied, a constant going forth as of evaporation. I told myself, this hugger-mugger totality wants nothing and does nothing." So in conditions like these, which involve a kind of endless, absolute unpredictability that in a way dissolves into homogeneity, the very possibility of both surprise and of normal, full-blooded forms of emotion, as I'll explain a bit later, may be called into question. Actually, is there a French word, fourmillon, which I think, was it fourmillon? The sense of, it's like insects, which are all moving, so if I understand the word correctly, fourmiller is like what things that ants do, right? It's like insects, they're all moving so fast, it's so unpredictability that the whole effect is disconcerting, but also homogeneous in a way. I don't know if we have a word in English for quite captures that. Swarming, yeah. Yeah, that's probably the closest. So in this sense, the radical dysregulation of perceptual saliences that can occur in schizophrenia may undermine the possibility of normal forms of surprise. We might even say that the ubiquity of surprise prevents the experience of surprise, if you want to put it in the most paradoxical sounding way. A second feature of surprise that is relevant here is the fact that it may need to occur in a real world, or at least in a world felt by the subject as real. Perhaps no surprise is possible in a world felt as imaginary, on the sort of analysis that we have of the imaginary from, say, Sartre or from Ed Casey. Now let me say just a word or two about the related notion of suspense, which could be defined as, I don't think anyone's much talked about suspense. Has that word come up? Because when I think of surprise, I immediately think of suspense. I mean, that's the thematization of surprise in a way. The suspense could be defined as the anticipation of surprise. And it will also disappear under conditions, the possibility of suspense will disappear under conditions where normal surprise is impossible. Suspense is an interesting thing to think about, because it seems to me that it's a mode of experience that, without stripping surprise of its arousing effects, nevertheless has the capacity to transform surprise into something almost opposite from what surprise usually is. So suspense is, in a way, the expectation of surprise. It transforms the fact of surprise, when it occurs, into, in a way, the resolution of a state rather than a source of perturbation, which is perhaps one way of understanding why we enjoy suspense so much. We might also say that suspense is a kind of meta-experience, one that brings the experience of an aspect of reality to the fore. It's been argued, some stuff I was reading on the internet the last couple of days, that we don't live in a kind of state of suspense. That's not really part of normal life, except perhaps under special conditions of danger, like, say, a soldier on patrol in the jungle. Yet maybe we realize at some meta or marginal level that in fact life, of course we do, that life is unpredictable. So in a sense, the experience of, say, a suspense novel makes us feel in greater touch with what we know in fact to be our usual condition. at some deeper level than we allow ourselves normally to experience. And some of this will become relevant later in my talk when I'm going to talk about the absence of suspense in certain schizophrenic phenomena. Okay. Now, so far I've used the terms emotion, affect, and mood. Now, from my reading, I'm no expert on emotion, but from the reading I did for writing this stuff, it seems to me that there is simply no clear and universally accepted understanding of the distinctions among these terms. The vocabulary of the emotional realm is a mess. And I'm going to make some generalizations, which I don't claim is the way they should be used. I do think, and maybe I'm wrong about this, not being an expert on it, I do think that the definitions I'm giving are extremely common, maybe even the most common, but who knows whether that's really true. So I'm going to use the word affect, which the Random House Dictionary of the English language defines as meaning feeling or emotion, as perhaps the most general word and the one best suited, along with phrases like affective response or affective reaction, to serve as a sort of generic term that can subsume all of these concepts or all of these possibilities. Not quite the use in psychiatry, where affect tends to mean expression of emotion, but it doesn't. But if you think of affective reaction, so that's my generic term. We can understand mood to refer to a state of mind that's more pervasive and less focused than an emotion. That's a standard thing to say, I think. Whereas an emotion is typically about some particular object, person, or situation, a mood is less targeted and more all-encompassing. I'm going to leave out feelings, because I'm not going to talk about that much, but that's another problematic term. Now, what about the passions? We might say that these are the quintessential emotions. So passions are a form of emotions which are extreme, the prototypical ones, therefore. Not surprisingly, the passions tend to focus on some particular object in the world, like someone loved or feared, and to have the qualities of immediacy, relevance, seriousness, and objectivity in high degree, fitting in, therefore, with Nico Freijde's description of what would really elicit emotion. The literary critic Philip Fisher has recently described the passions as typically bound up, not recently, 10 years ago, with either the imminent future, in the case, for example, fear and greed, or the immediate past, in the case of, say, shame, grief, and anger. The passions are deeply embedded in a temporal dynamism that is clearly illustrated by the trepidations of fear or the feverish anticipation of, say, greed. Now, this summary of concepts about affect and emotion, which I'm using in the way that I'm defining them, not everyone would define them that way, allows me to state my claims in summary fashion. In this article, I'm going to consider 3 modes of experience that are common in schizophrenia. By the way, not including the Fourmillon experience that I mentioned. That's not going to be part of what I'm going to talk about now. Certain disturbances of the lived body, certain alterations of perceptual meaning, and certain types of inner fantasy. I'm not saying these are all the only things that happen in schizophrenia, but these are important things that occur. And they occur particularly in, for those of you who are in the mental health professions in some way, the predominantly non-paranoid forms of schizophrenic experience. The question of paranoia would introduce a whole nother set of issues that I'm not going to address unless we talk about in the discussion. Each of these 3 forms of experience involves a distinct form of temporality and a distinct relationship to the issues of surprise and the possibility of the experience of suspense. Each involves or engenders a diminishment of some of the defining features of the concept emotion, especially the targeted and temporal nature of concern with its assumption of urgency, relevance, objectivity, seriousness. So I do believe that there's a measure of truth in the traditional view, or a common view, I should say, about flat affect, that often schizophrenia does involve a diminishment of emotional vitality or response. Often. Not at all moments, but often. But this doesn't mean that all forms of, I said diminishment of emotional response. This doesn't mean that all forms of affective life are attenuated. To understand the Kretschmerian paradox is to realize that in schizophrenia, diminished emotional response can be accompanied by forms of affect that may be no less intense than the emotions that they replace. So in other words, I'm going to argue that there are forms of increased affect along with decreased emotion in three examples. First of all, bodily alienation. The role of bodily experience has been recognized in emotional life since ancient times. William James, for example, and more recently, William James says, if we fancy some strong emotion and then try to abstract from our consciousness of it all the feelings of its bodily symptoms, we find we have nothing left behind, no mind stuff out of which the emotion can be constituted, and that a cold and neutral state of intellectual perception is all that remains. End quote. Now, in his relatively recent reformulations, Antonio Damasio, 1994, what's the book called? Descartes' Error, I think, argues that affective experience is generally rooted in what Damasio terms representations or images of the body that have come to be associated as what he calls somatic markers with particular contexts or stimulus situations. A point that Damasio neglects, however, is that normal emotional experience involves, in large measure, not representations of the objectified or objectifiable body image, so much as implicitly felt experiences involving what we could call the bodily subject. These would be experiences in which the somatic markers, patterns, or tension states of our bodily self-awareness are not experienced as objects in themselves, but as the tacitly inhabited medium of an attitude, such as fear, disgust, desire, an attitude directed toward the world. This point is crucial, actually. This is a phenomenological point that's crucial for grasping some of the distinctive features of emotional experience in schizophrenia. Because in such persons, sometimes, not always, a fragmented, alienated sense of the lived body can disrupt the world-directedness as well as the normal fluidity and flow of emotional experience and expression, leading in these persons to a sense of affective, emotional disharmony, artificiality, and distance. Now, bodily self-alienation in schizophrenia is obvious in the so-called first-rank symptoms of schizophrenia, which, for those of you not in mental health, means symptoms in which the patient feels that his own body or actions or even experiences are somehow under the control of some external being or force. But milder but analogous experiences of corporeal or bodily alienation have been demonstrated by German research on the so-called basic symptoms by Klosterkutter and others in Germany over the last several decades. And these are symptoms which occur in all the various subtypes of schizophrenia, as well as in the residual and prodromal or preceding phases before the psychosis. One important group of these basic symptoms consists in synesthetic experiences like, for example, sensations of movement or of pulling or pressure inside the body or on its surfaces, electric or migrating sensations in the body, awareness of kinesthetic or thermic sensations in the body, or the sensation that some limb or part of your body is getting larger or smaller than it normally would be. It's hardly surprising that such mutations affect both the experience and expression of emotion. Schizophrenia patients often feel there's something odd, unsatisfying, or awry about their facial expression or bodily gestures, that these are somehow not fully under their control, or that they do not harmoniously or accurately conform to or convey an underlying state of feeling or emotion. When experiences that normally exist in the tacit dimension come to be the objects of a more focal and objectifying awareness, one would expect profound transformations in the felt quality of affective life. Because these affectively charged configurations of bodily tension states don't serve as the medium of an attitude toward the world, since they've become the thing on which the patient's attention has been focused. And thus they don't feel genuine, natural, or appropriate to the context. They're experienced at a sort of subjective distance, almost as objects in themselves. In fact, it's not even clear that emotion would be an appropriate term for these quasi-affective or sensations or intensities that are dissociated from the ongoing sense of self or ipseity that gives more normal emotions a compelling quality of intimacy and personal relevance. When bodily states and processes replace persons and situations as the focus of awareness, the affective experience in question is deprived of an essential component of normal, targeted emotional meaning. They can't be part and parcel of a coherent and meaningful state of directedness toward an emotional target in the world, but they exist instead in a kind of free-floating space, as it were. Now, withdrawal from worldly emotional directedness of this sort can sometimes serve defensive needs, probably, providing a haven of escape from the unpredictability of external circumstances and the sorts of emotions or affects that would be associated with things in the external world. Research suggests, however, that states of arousal that cannot be identified cognitively, as is the case with these often, tend to be experienced as often disruptive and dysphoric. So it's not surprising that these free-floating object-like states of tension, common in schizophrenia, are often associated with a general sense on the part of the patient of a kind of indefinable, anxious perturbation, a kind of ontological anxiety that's not really directed at any particular kind of fear, but that's just a sort of state of something is weird, something is wrong. Now, in this circumstance, though, the external world, the usual source of surprise, has in a way been blocked out, not being really attended to. It's the body, which is not the source of the same degree of unpredictability that has become the object of awareness, of experience. And in fact, when you think about it, still maybe sounds a little weird to say, but in a way, not only is it the body that's become the object of awareness, but the thing that's become the object of awareness is the body as focused on by me. So there's a sense in which the kind of bodily experiences the person is having are themselves, in a way, the product of the looking. So the possibility that even the body could be a source of surprise in any normal sense is also diminished by this fact. So just as that one cannot tickle oneself, so one is even less likely to feel the usual sort of surprise that might have attended some bodily experiences. Okay, so that's the first, bodily alienation. I'm going to kind of just say a sentence or two about the second one, because I don't want to go on for too long. I want there to be some time for discussion. The third one I want to talk about at some length. The second one, which I call unworlding, is where you get, for example, the experience of the gestalt unity of the external world breaking up, or perhaps the affordances, if you know that term, of objects disappearing, so that instead of seeing this as a chair, I see it as a geometrical object. Or instead of seeing Tony's face as a human source of expression, I see, these geometrical forms, and the verticality of the nose and the circularity of the eyes, as if these were sort of geometrical objects, which in schizophrenia can sometimes happen. If that happens, you're going to have a diminishment of emotional response, because the human affordances, the things that matter to us in the usual sense, are just not there. If you're a geometrical display, you can't, the whole dimensions of, I don't know, human narcissism and desire for intimacy or aggression or whatever it may be between people are not really relevant, you know, because the subject behind the face has, so to speak, disappeared. And so you get a disappearance of normal forms of emotionality, replaced, however, by forms of affective arousal that may have a kind of surreal quality to them. So again, you can have a sort of diminishment of emotion, but not at all a diminishment of affective life in the general sense. In fact, even an increase of a certain kind of weird, surreal affect. But let me go to the third, subjectivization, which is more inward in character, bound up with imagination rather than perception, which was the case with unworlding, was more about perception, and likely to occur especially in the chronic and withdrawn phases of the illness. One patient with schizophrenia spoke, for example, of an introversion that occurred in a condition of inaction and that led in turn to a disruption of spontaneous activity. Let me jump ahead to this one. Yeah, here's this. So a patient says, I was lying in my bed and reality somehow passed inwards as if my brain turned round. I then became more interested in memory than perceiving reality around me. At the beginning I had a sense of despair, almost amounting to terror, later replaced by flattening. Now this sort of withdrawal often involves a turning of attention away from external or social reality in favor of a preoccupation with a delusional or quasi-delusional realm of inner fantasy. This is what Eugen Bleuler meant by the word autism, although that word has been used in a lot of different ways. But this is what Eugen Bleuler, who's the man who coined the term schizophrenia, meant by autism. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his Psychology of Imagination, spoke of the morbid dreamer, whose wish-fulfilling delusions were an attempt to escape not the content, but the form of the real. The delusional objects or situation the patient experiences do not, Sartre argues, and I think he's correct in many cases, have the full ontological status of what we call the real. That is, and I don't mean that necessarily in a Lacanian sense, by the way. Those of you who know Lacan, I just mean in a more normal sense of what is real. That is, they lack one or another of those crucial characteristics that are the marks of an objective realm independent of one's own mind and will, the objects of the delusion. They lack the ultimate unknowability of a realm that exceeds our grasp, or the recalcitrance of a realm separate from fantasy or whim that does not just do what we want it to do. These are the marks of the real. And often the delusional world, some delusional worlds, because there are many kinds of delusional worlds, but some delusional worlds lack those qualities. Now, such a view that Sartre takes, and others too, implies that rather than confusing delusion and reality, or rather than wishing to substitute delusion for reality in a kind of wish fulfillment fantasy, the morbid dreamer, a certain kind of deluded psychotic, you could say, actually demands the preservation of the distinction between delusional and real. Otherwise, the delusional world would, for the patient, be imbued with the same potential for uncertainty, danger, unpredictability, surprise, potential disappointment that is characteristic of the reality he wishes to escape. Now, there's a very revealing example of morbid dreaming and its associated forms of affective life in the prose texts of a man named Adolf Wölfli, who was is perhaps the most famous art brut artist, and a Swiss man who was a patient in the Waldau Asylum near Bern for a number of decades in the first half of the 20th century, and who spent most of his waking hours for decades engaged in the creation of visual works that illustrated, or prose writings that described his delusional fantasies and memories. And there's in Bern, there's a wing of, I haven't visited it, but have you been there? Anyone been there? There's a whole wing of a museum, I believe, devoted just to Wölfli. Anyway, during one period of his life, the delusions, or maybe we should call them quasi-delusions, in question involve memories of amazing but curiously timeless journeys that Wolfli himself had supposedly taken through an immense cosmos. In one passage, for example, and this is a very typical passage, and by the way, these writings is a picture of Wolfli standing there in his sort of Swiss peasant outfit with his hand on top of his writings, which are, this tall, so I haven't read them all. But I've read a lot of the excerpts that have been published of them, and this is a very typical passage where he speaks of witnessing objects and situations of overwhelming size and power, such as actually, that's a different one that I'm going to quote here. Okay, but the one I have here is, in one passage he speaks of witnessing objects and situations of great size and power, like the, quote, great giant glacier of the celestial stars of God the Father, which contains the greatest giant cave in the whole universe, a cave that holds a population enumerated as a 5, followed by 95 zeros. Or in this case, a walnut tree discovered on the island of the Echo of the Western Sea, whose trunk has a diameter of more than 12,000 leagues. And so it's all about colossalness. Now, I think that the best way of capturing the world of Wolfli's delusions from a phenomenological point of view is to use the famous concept of the sublime, a key aesthetic concept that dates back to the 1st century AD writer Longinus, but was later elaborated, as I'm sure some of you know, maybe most of you know, by Burke, by Kant, by Schopenhauer, and many other people. And here, by the way, looking at Tony, because I was thinking of a conversation we had yesterday, the day before, I'm entering into what I would call a form of hermeneutic phenomenology. Not hermeneutics as opposed to phenomenology, but hermeneutic phenomenology, as I understand what the Heideggerian tradition at least would mean by that, in which a concept from outside the experience itself, that is from cultural resources, like Schopenhauer's notion of the sublime, which I'm about to use, is brought to bear in order to clarify what is in fact quite an unusual form of experience, perhaps even a limit experience. And I wonder if this is akin to what Tony Steinbach talks about or writes about when he speaks of generative phenomenology. At least it would interest me to know if he would see it in that light after I present it, because it seems to me that it perhaps is. Okay, back to the issue of the sublime. Now, the sublime is always defined in opposition to the beautiful. Beautiful objects, according to Kant's classical account in the Critique of Judgment, have the quality of comprehensible form. By contrast, the sublime always involves an experience of something so colossal in size or scope or power that it beggars our mental capacities to imagine it. Instead of harmonious resonance, which we feel with a beautiful object, the associated affects with the sublime are organized around a sense of tension or opposition between objects we encounter and our inadequate faculties of knowing. They involve ambivalent feelings of repulsion from, as well as attraction to, the same object. That's the first and most crucial thing to say about the sublime. But there's another very important side to this paradoxical mode of experience that's brought out very famously by Kant, but also people know a little bit less about what Schopenhauer said, namely an antithetical experience of the power, centrality, even superiority of one's own mind or self when faced with what we could call the looming tremendousness of the world. I'm going to skip Kant because there's not time for everything here. And anyway, Schopenhauer is most relevant for me. Schopenhauer interpreted this inner infinitude in ontological terms, but meaning as involving an awareness of the mind's capacity not just to choose, which is what Kant emphasized, free will, but in a sense to create or constitute the world of our experience. Schopenhauer describes a characteristic oscillation, or coincidence even, of a sense of being abject and of being omnipotent, of being overwhelmed and of feeling one's own overweening power. The feeling of the sublime, writes Schopenhauer, arises, quoting, through the consciousness of the vanishing nothingness of our own body in the presence of a vastness which from another point of view itself exists only in our idea, and which we are as and of which we are as knowing subject the supporter. Another quote, the vastness of the world which disquieted us before now in us. Our dependence upon it is annulled by its dependence on us, on its existing only as our idea. So there's an oscillation here between feeling abject, tiny, impotent nothingness compared to the vastness of the world, and then in a later moment, this quasi-solipsistic, call it post-Kantian assertion of the world's dependence on the knowing self. This is a key feature, the key feature, I would argue, of Wolfli's quasi-delusional fantasies, and thus of the phenomenology of his delusional mode of experience. On the one hand, he describes being overwhelmed by the vastness of the imaginary world that looms before him. Because remember, this is this imaginary world of the vast, the echo of the tree of the echo of the Western Sea and all that stuff. And there are passages, which I'm going to skip now for time, where he describes being absolutely crushed by the immensity of these things that he's witnessing. But he also identifies himself, on the other hand, as a royal, even divine figure, as, quote, in his words, the very highest and most superior, great, great majesty, great, great God, Saint Adolf, born in Switzerland on the planet Earth. Or he identifies himself as great, great majesty, great, great God, great, great Kaiser, and great, great husband, holy Saint Adolf. There are even times in his writings when he describes himself as equally or surpassing God in the quintessentially divine act of cosmic creation, as when Wolfli describes blowing into what he calls the horn of omnipotence. That was lent to him by God. Oh, miracle and ravishment! Oh, splendor marvelous! Not only myriads, no, many oberons of stars. Oberon was a word he made up to mean the largest possible number. And fragments of the universe flew out of this horn, which he himself is blowing, in the direction of the south. And he describes then specks of dust coming out of this horn that he is himself blowing, which grow larger and larger until finally each speck of dust coalesces into a whole colossal new universe, that is, each of which is 11 times larger than the previous one created by God. Okay, so we see the two sides of the sublime here. Feeling overwhelmed, but on the other hand, a sort of Schopenhauerian sense of one's own centrality as the divine constitutor or creator of everything. Now, considered in one way, this instance of world creation, the blowing in the omnipotence horn, may seem the most absurd example of grandiosity you could possibly imagine. Almost a limit case of a grandiose delusion that implies belief in something not only false, but impossible. But from another standpoint, Wolfli's blowing of the omnipotence horn is a perfectly accurate, though allegorical, statement of the literal truth of his existence in the Waldau Asylum, where, after all, what was he doing? Spending his days immersed in his imagination, producing the worlds that he, in a sense, aptly terms the St. Adolf creation, or the St. Adolf giant creation. Because all of his descriptions of travels around the cosmos are obviously not literal journeys that he took, but journeys that he created. He created the universes that he then looked at, so to speak. There are even passages in Wolfli's writing when he acknowledges his own role in creating what he seems to be recognizing as only fictional universes. For example, he refers to himself in one passage as a candidate for the loony bin who devotes himself to the madman's pastime of mere fantasizing. I think actually this kind of implicit awareness at some level of the quasi-fictional nature or subjective nature of the delusional world is common enough in chronic and withdrawn patients with schizophrenia, many of them. And in fact, retreat into a world experienced as merely virtual can be a key motivation for the withdrawal itself. In saying that, I'm just repeating what Sartre said about the morbid dreamer. One striking feature of Wolfli's imaginary world is the lack of any particular target of concern. Now we're getting more into emotion and surprise, such as a specific object of fear or desire around which any normal sort of plot or narrative energy could organize itself. Wolfli refers to objects like the colossal walnut tree on the island of the Echo of the Western Sea, or the giant glacier of the celestial star of God's the Father, to give you the examples I mentioned before. But I think anyone who reads these texts would agree with me that they have an interchangeable quality, as if no object that he encounters has any particular importance other than its status as an exemplar of the amazing or the tremendous. So we could say that for Wolfli, the object of concern is not any specific person or thing within the world, but rather the world itself, or the world as a whole. Instead of having what we would call worldly concerns, by which I mean normal kind of concerns of things that happen in the world, he's concerned with the world itself, with its reality or unreality, and with the conditions of its creation. We might say, in fact, that the affective tone imbuing these realms of the amazing and the miraculous is more a matter of mood than of emotion, more a pervasive state of mind or feeling than anything like an affective emotional charge targeting a specific object of concern. And as for the particular kinds of mood in question, these I think are well specified by the concept of the sublime that I already mentioned, because they're really present-oriented affects, at most quasi-emotions, of wonder and amazement. You can see why I was wondering about what you had to say about amazement in a certain way, and maybe not exactly the same as your subjects, but combined with a paradoxical mode of self-experience in which abjection is constantly being undercut and overcome by surges of godlike grandiosity. So they're not really emotions in the sense of full-blooded emotions having to do with, love or fear in the world. They're either experiences of a kind of a sort of bloodless amazement, or of the sense of being godlike or something. Now, in this sort of world, the patient is likely to experience both more and less affect, depending on how you want to use these terms. Consider the fear of world catastrophe described in several classic accounts of schizophrenia. At least in some cases, the patient's fear that the universe will explode or disappear is associated with the patient's feeling of being a kind of divine quasi-solipsistic center who is somehow responsible for the world's very existence. One patient, quoted by Karl Jaspers, says, "The world must be represented or the world will disappear." And guess who represents it? Patient himself. Patients sometimes feel it is imperative to keep their body perfectly still lest the universe begin to tremble and collapse. From one standpoint, the dissolution of the world, which would seem to imply one's own death and the death of everyone and everything that one cares about, should be the most frightening prospect imaginable. But in another perspective, it's almost a trivial, because virtual event recognized at some level of experience as virtual by the patient, by the morbid dreamer. No more consequential in that sense than the blotting out of the world that occurs each time you blink your eyes. Now, a catastrophe of this kind necessarily lacks several of the core components of emotion, which would make a situation emotional or intensely emotional. They lack objectivity, relevance for action, urgency, seriousness. So by its very nature, a world catastrophe experience is therefore incompatible with a compassionate emotion in the paradigmatic sense of that term. It may arouse a kind of intense affect, but since the affective state involves no real change in action readiness, because it's irrelevant to action. It's known to be virtual at some level. It's likely to be framed or surrounded with a paradoxical kind of calm. And this is one of the reasons why the world that Wolfley's world, the world describes it as narrative, lack the consequentiality and the true unpredictability of anything real. And this is one of the reasons why his writings, which are sort of fascinating in a certain way to read, are also in a way intensely boring if you try to read them as narratives that might have narrative drive. Despite the emphasis on the colossal and the amazing, there seems no possibility of surprise, and hence an utter lack of suspense. The reader does not feel gripped on an emotional level. The world Wolfley evokes is a virtual world conjured by the self, and this self is always at least residually aware of its own conjuring. In fact, in Wolfley's case, we're talking about a sort of double virtuality in a way of the world, and a double blocking out of surprise. Not only is he engaged with the world in his narratives that's virtual in the sense of being the product of his own imagination, because they're just imaginary stories, which he has to know at some level are imaginary, but they're also fictions of a particular kind, of an extremely static kind, in which all that happens is the observation of big things. It's not like it's not like he's imagining detective stories or love stories or anything like that, which would be unreal because they're imagined, but at least would be about a world within which normal emotional life could play itself out. These are not only virtual by virtue of being imagined, also the kind of experience that's being talked about within the stories is in a way devoid of any kind of grip on the real and all of the sense of surprise, etc., that could involve. Okay, I had a little more to say perhaps about physiological measures and electrodermal response in schizophrenia. I'll just say a word or two about that. Because I tried in a thing I wrote about all this stuff to bring this phenomenology together with some of the findings about arousal, which is the main thing that's been studied in psychotic experience in relationship to emotion. And the forms of schizophrenic experience that I'm talking about can involve sometimes, there are two kinds of arousal. There's so-called tonic arousal, which is really about a state of arousal. Consider it almost mood-like. What's the general state of tension, so to speak, that you're in? That's tonic. And then there's phasic arousal, which is in response to something like a tone or a loud noise, which is more reactive. And I can tell you that to read this literature for a phenomenologist or a psychologist is a very painful experience, because it's just like the reporting of different kinds of experiments with nobody making any sense out of it. And I'm not sure I can make much sense out of it, but with regard to tonic arousal, sometimes schizophrenia patients have higher than normal, and sometimes they have lower than normal states of tonic arousal. I think you can relate that to some of these phenomenological worlds that I've talked about. If you think about something like Wolfley's world, this would be a state which would probably involve a state of tonic hypoarousal, because the general condition is a sort of emotional serenity in which nothing is really perturbing. Other things like the Fourmillon experience that I described would be states of tonic hyperarousal. So you can have both kinds of mood-like states, high and low in schizophrenia, but if you exclude paranoid schizophrenia, what you usually see is phasic hypoarousal. In other words, less reactivity to the world. That there seems to be a fair bit of consensus in the literature. And I think all of the conditions that I've described would involve phasic hypoarousal, because they all involve, in one way or another, a blocking out either of the world, as in the case of both bodily alienation, where you're focusing on the body and not the external world, or in the case of subjectivization of Wolfley, where you're withdrawn into an autistic fantasy world and not reacting to the external world. So things that happen are just sort of not noticed as much. Or the world is transformed through fourmillon, or fourmiller, or however you want to say it, this swarming experience, or through something like the loss of affordances, the geometric neutrality, in which case the world as a whole is kind of weird, but the possibility of any particular thing mattering much is in one way or another, well, not completely destroyed, but lessened. So I think that there are some correlations that one can draw between these studies of arousal patterns, which are primarily of electrodermal response, by the way, and the phenomenological story that one can tell here. But it's really the phenomenological story that interests me more. So thank you very much.